Hello guys, welcome back to our second video in our introduction to object-oriented programming with Python series. So in this tutorial, we'll be looking at what are the different methods that come with Python. So we'll talk about a method being basically describing the behavior of an object, and basically a method is just a function that exists within an object, basically a function that exists within a class, right? So if you're not a functionist, again, I have videos on my introduction to programming series, so you can check out that video on introduction to programming with Python series where we talk about functions. But basically, a method is just a function that exists within a class and that define the different behaviors of that class or an instance of that class. So once you have looked at that, let's go on to looking at the different types of methods we have. So there are regular methods. We'll cover all of these types of methods. There are regular methods, there's class methods, there's static methods, and then there are special methods. Okay. So let's take a look at one of the special methods known as a constructor. Okay. So let's take a look at what a constructor is. So what's basically a constructor? A constructor is just basically a method that gets called whenever you are creating an object. You can think of it as like initializer. So basically, in Python, we don't actually call it like constructor itself. We call it underscore init underscore. Okay, but in other programming languages, they are called constructors. And just to have a general overview of everything, I'm going to use the word constructor. But in Python, they're not like uh, most Python programmers don't refer to it as a constructor, but it's just the underscore init method. Okay, and that's one of the special methods, and that we'll look at. So we'll be looking at what a constructor is. So let's jump into what creating a constructor. So at the point of creating this object that we created in the last video, we had to like give each of these instances its name, its value. Like imagine that we have to create like 10,000 instances, means that you have to have a code like this typed out 10,000 times. Like that's really tedious, right? And that's not the whole concept of object-oriented programming. Is to keep your code dry as possible. And being dry means in programming means do not repeat yourself, right? So we are trying to keep our code dry as much as possible, and this way is not the best way. So how can we instantiate an object and also assign to it a name, first name, surname, admission number, and email at the same time? And to do this, we use a constructor, because a constructor is what is called at the point of creating that object. So by using a constructor, we can do everything in just this line of code without having all these lines of code, extra lines of code down here. So how do we do that? Okay, so I'm going back to my class here. So this, we talk about class variables in the last tutorial. So these are the class variables that we have. So I'm going to in here, I'm going to simply create a function def. I'm going to call it underscore init. So if I press enter, VS Code will automatically complete that for me. So basically, we're having underscore init underscore parentheses. You pass in the self. You have to type it exactly like this. You have to pass in the self, and then finally we have the type hint. But the type hint is not compulsory. You can also remove it if you want. But since this series is following modern Python syntax, you're going to leave the typing right there. Great. So that just by doing this, we have created basically a constructor or an initializer. So this initializer is called every time you create an object. So for example, we are creating an object here. This function here will be called. So in this function, let's go ahead and say print. Let's say object created. So this function is called every time an object is created. So now down here we're creating an object twice. So if we create the first object, this function will be called, and it's going to print object created. And you create an object again, this function will be called again. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this out in basically terminal and run this. So you can see up here we have object created, object created. So this is from the last video. So let me just go ahead and remove this. Let me just comment this code out for now. We'll come back to it. So if I run the code again, you can see object created, object created. So good. So this function will be called, the init function will be called every time you are creating an object, and that's basically the point of the init function. And also called the constructor function is the function that will be called every time an object is created. So good. Now, whenever you're creating an object, we want to go ahead and pass in the name and the values of the object so that it can be instantiated. So I'm just going to go up here and pass in these values right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and fix that indentation. And one thing you have to notice that everything under a class is indented, right? Okay. Okay, good. So once we have that done, I'm going to go ahead and use this self keyword. So what's the self keyword and why must it pass it in? Is it the must that you have to pass in the self keyword? Yes, an absolute must. An absolute. I can't stress on this enough. It's an absolute must. And that's a common mistake that most beginners make in Python, forgetting the self keyword. Okay. So it's a must that you have the self keyword. And I'll explain to you what the self keyword is just in a minute. But for now, let's go ahead and learn how to create to instantiate this. So self, basically the self is just required to the current object that you're working with at the point, right? So if you are working with student one at the point at any instance, then student one is going to be referred to as self within our class. So I want to say student one dot first name equals to John. So instead of doing that, you can just say self dot first name equals to John, and that will be student one. And if you're working in student two, then self will be student two. If you're working in student three, then self will be student three. Don't worry about the self keyword so much. I'm going to explain to you. It can be difficult to understand once you're getting started. Okay, so don't worry. I'm just going to replace every student one with self. Okay, and I want the names to be passed in, right? Because whenever I'm creating an object, I want the names to be, you can see that this is John and then there is Janice. So these names are different. So I want these names to be passed in as parameters. I'm going to pass in as parameters, and the person creating an object has to pass them in as an argument. So this will be first underscore name. We want the surname. So we want the admission underscore number, and finally we want the email address of that specific person. So I'm going to go here and simply say first name, and then this is going to be surname, and then you're going to have the admission number. So admission number, and then down here you're going to go ahead and have the email address of that person. So good, we have all those values passed in. So now if you're creating an object, at the point of creating an object, that's where this function will be called. So we need to pass in these parameters right here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pass in the first name, and the first name is going to be John, right? So I'm going to copy John and paste it in here for student one, and then comma, and then I also need the surname, right? So don't forget about this self keyword. You don't need to pass anything. You have to pass in the self, the surname, the admission number, and then the email address. So I'm going to pass in the surname, which is going to be Doe, and I'm going to pass in the admission number, which is going to be this down here. Pass it in, and then finally we pass in the this email address. And for the email address, I don't really need to pass it in because we can create the email address ourselves. And how do you create the email address? You're going to use an f string. You're going to say the first name, uh first name, right? First name, and then dot, and then the second, and then surname. Okay, and then after that you're going to say at my school school.com. Again, I'm going to change all this to lowercase because every email is lowercase, so I'm going to change everything in there into a lowercase. So that's how you can create the email ourselves. The email ourselves here basically. So if you know what f strings are, I cover this in my introduction to our program with Python series, so you can check out that video on working with f strings, string concatenation basically. So that's all we need to pass in. So we pass in the first name, right? The first name, which is John, the surname, which is Doe, and then the admission number. So we need to repeat the same for student two, which is the first name is going to be Janice. So I'm going to simply copy Janice from here and paste it in here. And then I'm going to have, after Janet, I'm going to have Doe. So I'm going to say Doe. Sorry, this is going to be Doe. And then finally I need to pass in the admission number, which is going to be this right here. So copy that. I'm going to copy this and simply paste it in here. So once I have this, I don't need all this code again. So you can see just by using a constructor, we have saved us ourselves a ton of work. So we just go ahead and delete this. We don't need it anymore. So that's going to go ahead and create for us the student object we pass using this value that we passed in. So good. So once we have this done, it's going to create the student object. So I can just go ahead and let me just delete this for now. I can go ahead in here. Let me move this, delete also this. I'm just going to move this one up here, and I'm going to uncomment this. I'm going to uncomment it and copy it and then paste it here. And this is going to be student 2. So student 2, great. So once we have that done, good, we are good to go. So now if I run the code, we're going to go ahead and create a two student objects using this value that we provided in. The constructor will be called, and it's going to say, for example, if you're working with student 1, then at that point, self is going to be student 1. So it's going to say self dot first name, which is basically student one dot first name in the background, right? So that's something that we can do. So once I have this done, I can go back to the code and run the code again. You can see John Doe and Janice Doe. So everything works as we had it working before. So that's basically what a constructor is in Python. Basically, make constructors are just functions within Python are called special methods. All right, not functions, rather they are special methods within a class that are called at the point of creating an instance. Okay. So good. So don't worry about the self keyword. I know it can be difficult for you, but for now, just leave it on the side. We'll come back to it just in a second. So now we have talked about constructors. Now let's look at regular methods in Python. So other regular methods in Python. So as I said, an object knows something and an object can do something, right? So let's say that you want to get a description of each student. So if I want a student, if I say student one, the description, I want it to return to me the student's first name, the surname, and then the admission number of the student, right? So I can go down here and have a function. I'm going to call it description, description, and it's going to take in the self keyword. All Python arguments must take in the self keyword, and this function, function or method is going to return to us a string. which is when basically the description of that student. So when you say return, you're going to be using an f string again. So when to return the first name, so we're going to say self dot first name. You're going to say here we're going to say self dot surname, and then finally we want to go ahead and say self dot admission number. So self dot admission number. Good. So once we have all that done, we are good to go. So what basically self means? So self is the object that you're working with at that instance. Okay. So if you're calling this description method on student one, then at that point student one self will be student one. So it's just the same as if I call this on student one, it's going to be student one dot first name, student one dot surname, and then student one dot admission number. Okay, this can be a bit confusing, so let me just call this method and explain it to you in depth. So I'm going to comment this out, and then I'm going to go down here, and let me just say simply calling a method. So good. So a constructor, you don't actually call a constructor directly. A constructor is called in the background whenever you're creating an object. So now that you have a a regular method, let me show you how to call regular methods. You don't need to call, you can call a regular method at any point you want. So how is this being called in the background, right? So what it's simply going to add and do is student one dot, and it's the name of the function, which is description, the name of the method rather, which is description, and then finally we need to pass in the self keyword. So the self keywords needs to be an object of student type, right? And that an example is this student one object, which is of student type, right? So if I'm going go ahead and paste in here, and that's going to return to us, if I hover, it's going to return to us a string, right? You can see it's returned to us a string, right? The return type is a string. So I want to go ahead and print this string right here. So I can just say print and then simply call that method. So call that and then go ahead and run the code. Now you can see that John Doe and then finally the admission number of John Doe, which is what is being returned from this description method. So now I hope now you have a clear idea of what self is, right? Because you're saying self student one, which is the name of the class, dot the name of the method, which is description, and then you have to pass in the self keyword, and the self, which is just an instance of the student class, right? It must be an instance of the student class. And you can see now we pass in an instance of the student class, and it's going to go in here. So student class, student one is going to be our self now. So it'll be student one dot first name, student one surname, student one dot admission number. So that's what's going on in the background, and that's why you have to pass in self. Okay. So another way of doing this in Python, let's actually just call this on the second student object. So I'm going to print out let me just put this in quotes and just print out a line here. And then down here, I'm going to go ahead and simply do the following. So I'm going to say print, I'm going to say student one dot description, and then I'm going to go ahead and pass in the student object I want. It's going to be student two object. Great. So if I run the code again, now you should get the description of student two. It's going to be Janet Doe, and then the admission number of Janet Doe. So good. So we have another one way you can see this in Python is that people don't actually use this method to call this approach to call a method, right? The name of the class, the name of the method, and then you pass in the object that you want to call the method on. Another way people do this in Python is another simpler way, and this is called syntactic. I hope that's spelling syntactic. Sugar, just like that. So syntactic sugar is just like an add-on, like a cheat code. Like if you ever played like video games, you have cheat code, right? So it's just like a cheat code that you can use to do something in a much more simpler way. So you can just say student one, or let's say student one dot description, and then simply do this. So just by doing this using this approach, you get the same result as using this approach up here. So let's go ahead and actually print the return string out. So I'm going to go ahead and simply print that out. So basically, if you run the code, we'll get the description of John Doe, which is going to be John Doe and then the admission number. So you can see John Doe and then the admission number of John Doe. So that's another way you can. So these two lines of code here basically are doing the same thing. So this is just called a syntactic sugar, make things much more simpler. Because if you're doing student one description, Python knows that you're calling the student one, the self is going to be student one. So you don't have to go ahead and explicitly pass in self. In the background, Python knows that our self in this case is going to be student one because we are calling this on a student one object. So the self is going to be a student one object. So you don't have to go ahead and use the name of the class, the name of the method, and then pass in the object directly. You can just say the object name dot description and then passing call the method, right? So that's basically what is called. This basically is just a syntactic sugar, basically of doing the same thing. So these two lines of code do the same thing, and what you see most people doing in Python is using this line. Like it's much more simpler and more intuitive, right? So yeah, so now I use this to explain to you why we have the self argument right here. So it has to be self, and you have to call it, self. Okay, so we just call it self in Python. I don't know if you can use, oh, you can use any other variable. Let's say we just change it to be uh let's say let's say obj, or obj, that's object. And up here I'm going to change this to be, I'm going to double select this and then change it to be obj. So good. So once we have that, if you run the code, will it work as we expect it to? Yeah, it works as we expect it to. But in Python, mostly we just use the self keyword. Okay, so just take it to convention and use self keyword. If you use obj and you show your Python code to another Python developer, they might be confused at first, but they will understand how it works, right? So basically we just use the self keyword basically. So that's it. And that's it for how to work with the regular methods and the importance of, and the why we know what the reason why we use self, right? So basically, so I've looked at the regular those regular methods. Now let's look at class methods. So in the last video we talked about class variables and instance variables, right? So we also have something called the class method. Okay, let me just jump into the code and show you what we mean by that. So, for example, we have this right here, and I showed you that the only way that you can modify these values is by using the name of the classes of. Okay, I deleted the code, but it was there previously. And if you have any issues, you can go back the last video and check that out. Okay, so I told you that the best way to modify a class variable is by using the name of the class itself, right? So we can also create a method to do this for us, so that we don't have to go ahead and do this manually ourselves all the time. And that's the whole point of class variable. So to create a class variable, what you have to do is just create a normal regular method. So let's say change, let's say set underscore school ranking. So let me call test set school ranking. It's gonna be a method. It's gonna take in the CLS and then simply go ahead and simply say pass. And then in here, we're going to go ahead and simply you're going to use a decorator, what you call a decorator. You're going to say class method. So good. So we say class method. So this is a decorator, what you call a decorator in Python. So if you know what a decorator is, I have a whole tutorial on what a decorator is on my channel. You can go ahead and check that tutorial out. But I have a tutorial on decorator. So decorator, I'm not going to explain what a decorator is, but basically takes in an instance, takes in a callable as an input and returns a callable as an output. That's the basic information I can give you about classes. I don't this sorry about decorators. I don't want to go into depth about decorators. So good. That's how you can create a class method in function. Sorry, in Python. And you can also see we are using the CLS, which stands for the class, and not the self. Self is for an instance. CLS is for a class. So we always use CLS by convention. This can be anything you want, but you call it CLS by convention. So stick with Python conventions and follow the best programming practices. It's called a CLS. Okay, good. So once we have that done, we are good to go. So once we have this now, this now is now a class, basically a class method. And class method, the two main purposes of class methods now, they're used to modify class variables, and also they can be used as alternative constructors. So now let's see that we can use them as class variables. So let's say I'm going to say class, the name of the class, and I'm going to say dot school ranking, which is this class variable that we have up here. I'm going to say class ranking. I'm going to change it equals to the value that let's say the user is going to pass in a value. So if a user passes in a value, you're going to use that value down here. So that's basically what we have as a class function. Sorry, like as a class method. So if I go down here, I can simply go ahead and let me just go ahead and delete some of this. Let me just go ahead and I don't even need all of this. I'm going to delete all of this. So delete these two. So we have learned how to call methods, right? So let's go ahead and actually call the class method. So I'm going to simply say class. I'm going to simply call this on I can call this on an instance of the class, or I can call this on the class itself. So let me just go ahead and show you how to call it. So again, we're just going to go ahead and simply say student class student dot set school ranking. So I say student dot set school ranking, and the student, the name of the class, and then finally we set the method, which is just a class method, which is set student ranking. So it's expecting us to pass in a value which is going to be of type basically this can be of type int, right? So you can say of type int, and if I hover here, you can pass in student. We're going to pass in value. It's going to be of type int. So I can just go ahead and pass in the value. Let's say the ranking changed to 4th, the school drop in performance or something, and I can go ahead and simply print student this dot school ranking, right? So I can say school ranking, and if I go back and print it now, school ranking should be 4. So if I print it right here, school ranking is 4. Good. So that's how you can set. Another way you can set it by using the name of an instance of that class. So if I go ahead and change this to be the name of an instance, and that's also going to change it to be 4, right? So I can either change it in the name of the class or the name of an instance, but it makes more sense that you use the name of the class, because that's a class class method in the first place. So what you see, what the best convention, just use the name of the class rather than an instance of that class whenever we're trying to access class methods. So good. So that's how a class method can be used to modify existing class variables. That's the first use of a class method. Another use of a class method is using class methods as an alternative constructors. So I told you this is basically what a constructor is, right? So this is a constructor right here. So let's say you want to, okay, you can also, some people also use class methods as an alternative constructor to create an object, because you can just say, I create an object in the name of the class and then simply return that object. So let's actually use this to create an, let's say, let's have a class method. So we are going to have a class method, which is going to be called create underscore instance, right? And it's going to take in the CLS method, and it's going to take in the first name, because we want to pass in the first name, right? First underscore name, the surname, and then finally the admission underscore number. So great. So once we have that, I can, let me go ahead and just pass this for now. So this is going to be a class method. So I'm going to go down here, up here, and I'm going to use the decorator, the class method decorator on this. So good. So now once you have this, how can you use this to create a class? Now, how can you, sorry, how can you use this to this class method to create an instance of the class? So you can see right here, this is how you created an instance of a class. We use the name of the class, which is going to be passed in form as CLS, and then finally we need to pass in the first name, the surname, and then the admission number, which is what we have right here, right? So now let's go ahead and do that. So let's say I'm going to create a variable which is called new underscore instance, and it's going to be I don't know if instance it's an S or a C. So instance is going to be equals to it's going to be of type of CLS. It's going to be equals to CLS, and you're going to pass in the first name, right, the surname, and then finally the admission number. Great. So once we have that, we're going to go ahead and return the new underscore instance to the caller of that class method. So if I go in here, let's go ahead and create student 3. So I'm going to go and say student 2. I'm going to send this to be student 3, and it's going to be of type student. It's going to be equals to let's say student, right, the name of the class dot create instance, and you're going to pass in the first name, let's say Tommy, right, Tommy, and let's get, and then say the name is Shelby. I don't know if you guys watched Tommy Shelby. And then finally you pass in the admission number, just a random set of numbers. So it's going to be Tommy Shelby basically, and you can print out student student 3, student 3 dot student underscore 3 dot first name. You can also print student sorry, this is going to be student 3 dot surname. That's basically what I want to do. Or I can even call this a description method on this one, but for now we can just call this. So let me just comment this out for now. So now you're using a class method to create an instance. So that's another way that class methods can be used as alternative constructors, right? So if I go ahead and run the code again, so you can see now we have Tommy Shelby object being created. So if I can go ahead and simply do print, I can print out student to student 3 dot description, just like that, call that. So if I go ahead and run the code, we get back Tommy Shelby, the admission number. Yeah, so that's great how you can create an object using a class method. So a class method can be used to modify class variables, and also can be used to create as alternative constructors to create an instance of the class. And one thing is that avoid using in class instances, right, to call a class method. Always use the name of the class itself to call a class method. That is more intuitive and it's a better practice. Even if you use even though you can do the same thing using an instance, but basically let me just show you how you can do it with an instance. Let's copy student 1 and let's paste it here, and you can also do that, and that's also going to work. So if I run the code, it also works fine. But basically avoid doing that, and always use the name of the class to call class methods. Okay. Okay, good. So we'll talk about class method. Now let's talk about static methods in Python. So sometimes we want to create a method that does not really need to take in a class or an instance of the class in order to do its function. Let's say that we have a method that simply returns to us the school ranking. Basically, it just returns to the school ranking. We don't need to know any instance is calling that class. We don't even need to care which function, which class is being used to. You don't need to pass the name of the class when calling that object, right? When calling that method, we just want to return the name of the school's ranking. We don't care about which instance is calling it or which class is being passed in, right? So that's why we use instance variables in such cases. Sorry, static variables in such cases. So I'm going to say self. I'm going to say get let's say get underscore school underscore rank. So let's say get school rank, and you don't need to take in anything. So this school rank function is going to return to us an integer, right, the school's ranking, and you're going to simply go ahead and return student name dot school ranking, the student class dot school ranking. That's all we want to do. So if I go down here, I can simply go ahead and call that static method on any object I want. So right now we have to have done, this is not a static method, right? This is not a static method. It looks like a regular method, yeah, but it doesn't take in the self keyword. It's because we say that the static method does not take in either the class or the instance. So I have to go in here and simply, how do you make this to be static? You have to use a static decorator, static decorator on it. So I've used a static decorator. Now this is now a static method. So I can go down here and I can simply print out that information. I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and I can print out student, let's use student 3, student 3 dot, and I can simply say this, sorry, not description, I want to get the get school ranking, and I call that method. So if I call that method and run the code again, I get a school ranking as 2. So good. That's how a static method works. So a static method is just like a regular method or a class method, but does not take in any arguments. That's basically it. And how to create a static method? Just define a normal Python function that does not take in any arguments, and that has the static keyword on top of it. Okay, that's basically it. You can take arguments if you want to, but basically most what I see most Python programmers doing, they don't take in any arguments whenever working with a static method in Python. So good. So we have looked at what a static method is. Now, section 3, we're going to be looking at special methods. That's what we'll be covering in the next video. So, guys, thanks for watching. Again, if you like this tutorial so far and they're helping you, one, you can support the channel simply by liking this video, dropping a comment in the comment section below. And if you want to help the channel develop further, you can support me by buying me coffee. The link is going to be in the description. So thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Keep safe.